the network. My name's Helen McElhinney. I'm the executive director. And we're part of a global network that grew out of an initiative back in the Haiti earthquake between a bunch of aid workers and journalists who wanted to make sure that we were using communications and tech to listen well to those people who were affected, and to be able to improve the impact of what we were trying to do. Now, past public forums have tackled issues including digital inclusion, algorithmic accountability, technology and power in aid, and last year, safeguarding information in the age of AI. And these are all on the website, should you be interested to look it up. But this year's event, I'm very excited about because we're going to be talking about meaningful community participation and exploring whether crisis-affected communities can hope to co-create and control the technologies shaping their lives. So we are all very aware that AI and digital technologies transform the humanitarian landscape around us at the moment, and that they bring tremendous promise as well as some challenges. And central to how all of this plays out will be the question of who holds power over data, over that technology, and over the architecture that supports it and surrounds it, including, and particularly importantly, in humanitarian settings. So I'm delighted that getting us thinking through all of this today is our terrific keynote, and I'm pleased to say also one of CDAC's newest trustees, Nyalleng Moorosi. Nyalleng is a senior researcher at the Distributed AI Research Institute. Her research focuses on how we build models which put populations, often peripheral, at the center of how we build. Before DAIR, she was a research software engineer at Google, where she was one of the first employees at the Google Africa Research Lab. She is a founding member of the Deep Learning Nthiga, the largest machine learning consortium of AI and machine learning practitioners in Africa, and also a member of the A+ Alliance, a coalition that seeks to not only detect but correct gender bias in AI. So without further ado, Nyalleng, if I could welcome you to the stage.
Thank you. Thanks, Helen. So are the things good now? Are we steady? They were going on and off. So I was like, ooh, okay. All right. Let's see. Does this work? Yep, that works. Okay. Yep, that works. I should be going the other way. And I'm going the wrong way. And this always happens. Okay. So here's the thing, whatever direction I go, oh my God, okay, so it is biased. Great. This is biased. You see, the forward one is much bigger, so the error, with high likelihood, you're going to be here. And then the backward one is smaller, and so you'll get there infrequently. This is truly AI bias, and now I'm failing because of it. Okay. I'm Nyalleng Moorosi, as Helen introduced me. I'm going to talk to you today about something that has been a bit of an obsession actually recently. And it's been, what does technology look like when we build for ourselves? Now, I met Helen and a couple of other people earlier on, for example, Monica, in June. I am new to the humanitarian space. I really have only ever built technology and groups and built communities. But an interesting thing for me about the humanitarian space with AI is the fact that this is the really true last mile, right? Like you are working with populations that are often underrepresented in very powerful spaces, right? These are some of the most marginalized, dispossessed people. And they are incredibly diverse. And their needs are incredibly diverse, right? And so the reason why they become the people that you have to rush to in a crisis, also those reasons are often quite different. And so, you see, the thing that AI knows how to do is to aggregate very well. It knows how to take big chunk of information and decipher the most important things. But where you build with really small chunks of data and information, and you're building for that very, 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 very narrow person. So anyway, I thought maybe if I talk about how, for example, we have been building. I'm from Lesotho. I am definitely one of those people. As I roam around in all these spaces, I think about how underrepresented I am in AI. It's a Black woman from Lesotho who's in tech. And so I've just been like, okay, what does tech for me look like? And so the idea of building for the marginalized is like, it's not marginalized for me. It is the center. It is the core. It is the thing I build for. All right. So AI is everywhere, right? It's in vogue. Everybody's talking about it, and it is doing all the things. But I think one of the really important things, as we are talking about this technology, and all the different words that it describes, which I won't get into, but this Venn diagram actually illustrates how they relate. And all of these words, and they're not exactly interchangeable, they mean quite different things, but that's not necessarily important. I think what is important, especially for a group like this, is what type of AI do I want to build? Okay? All of these things, they can come together and build for you an AI system. You can use generative algorithms and your computing and you build your system. Or you can use deep learning and you build your system. I mean, these words are just, they're not as important unless you need to talk about things like where and how you need to build. But the definition that I think is important is about what type of product you want to see. So there's this lovely metaphor that I just saw recently as saying, not defining the AI you want to build or the AI we want to regulate is like not defining the vehicle you want to build or you want to regulate. Because now the way you're thinking about a bicycle is the same way that you're thinking about an airplane. And we know how vastly those are. And the things you can do with AI and the different forms of AI that exist are really vastly different. Like really vastly different. It might seem from all these discussions that majority of AI is what is it called? Okay, I'm so used to calling it Gen AI. Generative, yes. It might seem that the most, like everything is generative AI. It is not necessarily truthful that everything is generative AI. And I'm going to give you an example of a system that we used using very, very simple AI. I share this because I think it should be, people should realize that they too can build and they do not need many millions, hundreds of millions of dollars to build, right? Because this is the scale at which the current generative AI systems have been built. They are multi-million-dollar systems which take terabytes of data, which is massive amounts of data, which I'm not even sure I've ever touched a terabyte, like actually not even a tera, like a petabyte. I think that's where a lot of these models are. Okay. But basically what I want to talk about is what is AI? AI is a simple mapping. There's two ways to understand what it is. It's a mapping. You have input and you're predicting an output. That's all. You have an observation and you want to know what's the likely thing that I'm going to see, right? I observe a certain thing happening. What's going to be like the likely outcome of this? All these systems are built like this. The second way to understand what AI is actually the generative form. In AI, what we're trying to do is we take all the data and we're trying to learn the process that gave you that data that you saw. So you're trying to learn the function, the underlying process that gives you this. This is why it's called generative, because you take the data, you take the example, and you mimic and you generate things that look like it. So in fact, generative AI itself is very old, even though I keep forgetting the name. And it is just absolutely fundamental to what AI is. You'll see that if you can learn the underlying function that generates these, then you can also predict. So actually, these two things are about the same. They're just different ways of looking at the thing. But basically, it's just a mapping. And you have to use this kind of mapping because the problem you're trying to solve for is really complicated, right? There is no easy way to determine what is the feature that's going to lead to this one kid to end up passing. And I'm going to predict and I'm going to know that if a kid shows up at 7:30 every morning, they're going to get an A in class, right? You have a really complex space and you're trying to learn from this complex space. All right. Now, in the humanitarian space, what I find very interesting is there is hype in both sides, right? AI is going to come and it's going to make it so that humanitarian agencies are going to save a lot, right? Like we're going to do so much more with so little. And then on the other hand is the thing of, but we are so scared because we are
recording in progress.
Vulnerable populations, right? So you've got these two sides, which I leave it to you to decide which way is going to be what. But in order to start off, one of the biggest things to build, if you're going to be building for yourself, if you're building at the edge, which is kind of like what I think you'd be building at, what we need to do when we build at the edge is, first of all, we need to collect examples, right? These are the participatory methods, right? And this is where the people actually tell you what their world looks like. This is actually very important. And a lot of the time, this is not going to be the information you can just find on the internet. So this is the first place, right? It would be great if the actual very first place is where you contact communities and say, what are the most pressing problems? So then you've got the problem. And then the next one up is, what are the features that are informative in this space? If I want to learn about this process, what are the things that are descriptive of this process? Because that's what data is supposed to do. Data is supposed to be descriptive of the process so that you know and you can predict and you can model the process, right? So ground data is supposed to describe to you the observation, right? It's supposed to be the thing that gives you the evidence. So you go and you collect ground data. So I'll give you an example of like the project I'm going to be talking about. We were classifying neighborhoods. Our ground data was to actually talk to community people and say, where do you think your neighborhood belongs? And the reason we had to do that was because the government was not giving us the granularity that we need to actually solve the problem that we needed to solve. Okay, so you see, this is the other layer. It has to be informative and it has to be at the granularity that you need. And people really know about their world. So it is labor intensive, which is probably, I'm sorry, I'm just blocking your view. I was like, okay, I feel like I'm blocking the view over here. Getting data is very labor intensive. This is why we get all these reports about people being underpaid, because you have to label so much data for so many different things. However, if you are specific about what you need to build, there is no need to be building that way. Because one of the reasons why we are running into these kinds of systems that, you know, we've got underpaid labor and all of these other social problems is because we are building an I can do everything system, right? Like a system that does everything. And obviously it is quite expensive. An interesting one is that it actually requires rigorous evaluation. The evaluation part is the part about the data has to be informative, right? So you'll see as you're solving the problem that sometimes you actually realize that I don't need this. I can do away with this. Or I need more of this kind of data. Okay. An interesting thing in this space is motivation. People don't just build technology. We build the technology and we embed within the technology the values we hold. Like we, people who build the technology, we embed within it the values that we hold. So this is also something to I think it's very important to audit the values you want to build for and actually build for those instead of like running away from them. You know the problem, you can anticipate the solution and try to build for that. All right, so this year we had a lovely conference. We had a conference in Brazil where we talked to some of the people who build for their communities. What are some of the things that you do? How do you think your knowledge of your community ended up shaping the product that you built. We had Caleb, who is Maori from New Zealand, Kathleen Siminyu, who's actually from here. She's a Nairobi fellow, and Ivana, who is from who's from Argentina. So some of the things that we worry a lot about. So for example, Caleb, the biggest thing for him was data sovereignty. Whatever he was going to build, his community was going to have the decision, was going to hold on to the data, was going to have the rights over the data. These are the issues that people like get concerned about. So if you go out and you ask people for their language data and you build a system, it should come to mind about who is the primary benefactor of this, right? Because these people who we have been building for, we're building with, they have been interviewed before, and their information and their knowledge just gets taken. And the next thing we have yet another billionaire. Right? Kathleen was very, very about the definitions of the language. So she was building Kiswahili tools, and she was trying to put together, like, make sure that the true Swahili people who speak something apparently very different from the current Kiswahili that is spoken, that those people too are represented, that those people do not get buried first by colonization and now get buried under by AI. This was her thing. If she was going to build Kiswahili, she was going to build a Kiswahili that also reflects the history and the presence of these people. And then finally, Ivana, for her, she was building a system for courts in Argentina. And for her, the biggest thing was privacy. She was like, because she was building systems that did like gender-based violence. And she was like, no one can ever have access to my database, to my data, to my whatever. And these are some of the things that we have to think about as we're building. Because that meant, for example, for Ivana, that she was not ready to build tools that utilize the cloud. She was not ready to use tools that used something like ChatGPT, right? Because as you're using it, it is taking in the data. It is continuously learning from the data. So she was ready to build with fairly rudimentary methods, because for her, privacy was the most important thing for her population. So this is an example for us that we decided to build. So a while back in 2018, I'm sitting in an office at CSIR. It's the heyday of computer vision. So, you know, the part of AI where you use vision stuff, so images and video and stuff to learn stuff. And we're like, I wonder how South Africa has changed since the end of apartheid. Do people actually live differently? Right? We had been walking around and the country looked different. We were moving around the country differently. But it was like, could you see these differences from the sky? Right? And one of the things was that we had a massive bias. And our bias meant that we were not going to be happy until this one specific problem was solved. And that problem was, could we appropriately classify the historically Black neighborhoods? The designated Black neighborhoods during apartheid. These are called the townships, right? Could we classify and be able to see the changes in the townships? And any model that could not classify and detect the changes in the townships well was not a model that we thought was correct. And this is exactly how software gets built. Like, you think about it later, but the way we evaluate systems is like, you have a thing in your head that the system must be correct for. And until it gets there, it's not correct. And it's funny. And this is why it's like, you know what, the whole thing of building inclusive and bias-free and everything is so difficult. But anyway, so this is South Africa, right? It is known for being one of the most unequal. So you can have fairly nice neighborhoods, and then you see the same thing in many places. You've got it here in Nairobi, you have it in Accra, you have it in Lagos. You see this separation of neighborhoods that, you know, historically populations were not allowed to live here, and then migrant labor moved closer to the jobs, right? And so you get this sort of structure. Okay. So this is one of the things that we did. So we were going through, and each one of these dots is like a house, and then we collapsed together all of these dots, and this is how we were making neighborhoods, okay? And then people would like help us put this together, like, you know, and on a much clearer map than this. But, you know, this line here, is it still part of the township or is it not part of the township? And this is where we were consulting and building the data with the people who actually lived in the township. But having built that kind of data set now, where we can classify and track and all of this. This year, we're able to actually do so much more. So this year, the government of South Africa passed a national health insurance bill where they are giving access to health, improving health access to many more people. And now we were able to use our data to quantify and measure who actually has access based on the neighborhood. Some of the things that we know is there hasn't been very much for like people in the villages. So down here is the number of people that have to get to one specific hospital to use it. That's almost 500,000 people here at the top. So the more yellow it is, the closer it is to that top mark. So that just means like you need more hospitals there. And this is information that you build just from satellite imagery and Google Maps. Just from that, you are able to quantify something like this and inform policy, or as you see, like later on, I'll show you, like we've got some NGOs, we've got social activists and people like these coming through for this kind of data because it's a mapping data. They want to know who's where and who has access and who doesn't have access. So for example, if we look at like who has access to like private hospitals, we find people who were in the historically well-to-do neighborhoods are still the people who have the most access. Not very surprising, but it is something that informs how you open up access for other people. Should it be that then you give the population vouchers to go to private hospitals because there are so many more? But then also, they are not very close to people. They are not very close to the townships. They are actually close to the people they were built for. So what else do you need to do to actually solve this problem? So what does it all mean at the end? So one of the things that we realized was we were able, through this kind of analysis, there's a lot more of these kinds of plots, sorry. Through this kind of analysis, we were able to actually test how resilient the system was. So because you have all of these people that are going to one hospital, all however many of them, like 40,000 or so people going to like the same hospital, because you've got that and you've got all these bed shortages, one of the things that happened was there was a series of events in the Johannesburg area where the major hospitals lost their wing. So like the cardiac surgery wing was closed. And now, because we had data about the population and where the majority of the population were and where the hospitals were, we were actually able to plot something like this, which actually shows you. So these, like how many people now are going to have to travel. So this is the first hospital that closed. This is the second hospital that closed. This is the hospital that they all have to go to now. That's 100 kilometers away. This here, this line here, we have around 5 million people. So now you have about 5 million people now going to the same hospital because 2 hospitals lost their surgery, their cardiosurgery services. And it just goes to show just how brittle the system was. You only needed to have 2 systems fail. Now, the ones here in purple are actually private hospitals, which a lot of these populations would not have access to. And so here I've highlighted like all of the private hospitals that offer the service and are within 20 kilometers. Now, I'm sure you can see how much, by the way, these are all the people, I'm going to skip through this. These are all, so what we're doing now is we're building policy, we're influencing, we're sharing. South Africans love to sue their government, so we're giving them all this data so they can go and sue their government, and the government can do a little bit better. So these are some of the people that we're now working with. But now I've lost my thought because I wanted to just like rush through this. Yes, but what I wanted to say is I am sure you can see how much on-the-ground knowledge you needed to build something like that. For one, when we were building our algorithm, it was failing a lot to detect townships because townships today are a mixed income neighborhood. So it thought part of the township is informal settlement, part of the township is a suburb. But because we were so adamant about townships, we finally built for them. And because the Constitution of South Africa is based on transformation, now we're able to actually directly inform because townships are one of those places that the transformation policies were meant for. So this book came out. It's highly anticipated. Have a look at it. I love these 2 authors here. I think they were like last year's AI 100 people, so they're very big. But one of the things I love about them is they situate AI and they take it out of both the doom and the hype. They situate it, and the question is, what can AI truly do for me? What can AI actually solve? Now, I think the most important thing to be able to answer this question is you've got to first of all decide, what do you want to do? If you can answer, you have got to do that first. Otherwise, you're going to get subpar results. I can promise you that. If you go too wide or you have an ill-defined question, you're going to run out of resources. You're not going to get to where you need. But if you can ask properly, what is the system I want to build, you will be able to get the resources that you need. Because like I said, AI is not a multi-million-dollar. I mean, we built this entire system using our little university just the system in a lab. This whole classification thing was built by a master's student, okay, in her lab. So yeah, that's it from me. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. And I love that we ended on snake oil, but also optimism. So yes, there's dangers, but look what it can do. And if a master's student can do that, just imagine what some of us sitting in this very room might be able to do. Thank you very much, Nyalleng. Now, as the panelists come up and join me here on the stage, I'm going to test our capabilities with basic technology. So hands up, who likes Slido? If you can get your phones out. Yes, here we go. You should online and in the room be able to join us in conversation and give your views and feedback on what we just heard. What resonated? What confused you? What do you want to hear more about? We would welcome all of those views. I see lots of phones pointing at the stage, so I'm just going to give us a minute to have a look. And while you are diligently doing that in the background, I'm going to introduce with great pleasure the rest of the panel who are joining me today. We have, just to my left, Angeline Akai, who is a data values advocate from here in Nairobi, Kenya. Welcome, Angeline. Thank you for joining us. Nyalleng needs no introduction. And so moving swiftly on to Patrick Gathara, Senior Editor for Inclusive Storytelling at the New Humanitarian, also based here in Nairobi, Kenya. And last but not least, Monica, who is an open technology advocate working based in Nairobi also. Thank you very much. So please welcome the panel. I'm going to turn to Angeline first. Angeline, you've recently studied data values and are now a very prominent data values advocate. Why is data so important to all of this? And is all data equal?
Oh, thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. It's great to be here. Thank you very much, Helen, for this wonderful question. Data is often celebrated as a game changer, and I call it the fuel to inclusion. So data enables rapid assessment, resource allocation, and also tailored interventions. But the question is, what happens when the data systems we rely on are flawed? That is the question we have to ask ourselves. But I'm going to answer, it's my time to answer this question. So when data practices, whether through negligence, bias, or exploitation becomes harmful, they risk doing the very opposite of what they intend and deepening existing inequalities and exacerbating vulnerabilities. So as we sit on this panel today, I urge us to critically examine the ways harmful data practices impact the very communities we seek to support. And more importantly, I ask how we can ensure that humanitarian data initiatives uplift rather than oppress, empower rather than exploit. So we have a lot of the impact we feel when data is excludes. We have to ensure that data is more inclusive. So the question is all data inclusive? That is how I can rephrase the question that you have asked. So I feel that some data excludes. One of the most pervasive forms of harm is exclusion, and too often data collection fails to disaggregate data by gender, disability, age, or ethnicity. This lack of granularity means that entire groups, that is women, girls, persons with disability, ethnic minorities, are rendered invisible in data systems. So I'll give an example. Take a refugee camp. Women and girls face heightened risks of gender-based violence, for example, and often they lack access to reproductive health services. If the data collection tools fail to account for these realities, critical interventions for these groups are overlooked, leaving them unsupported. So I'll give another impact that really harmful data can cause. It can reinforce stereotype, which is a very big issue that arises when data collection reinforces harmful stereotype. So tools designed with these biased assumptions may, for instance, depict women solely as, caregivers while ignoring their roles as economic contributors or leaders. Such narratives not only misrepresents the lived realities of crisis-affected communities, but also perpetuate cycles of marginalization. So I'll give another example. Thirdly, the issues around privacy, especially in risks, crisis settings where trust is already, fragile. So mishandling data can have devastating consequences. Imagine the risk if the location of survivors of gender-based violence, for example, accidentally is exposed, or consider the implication of sharing data with, unscrupulous, for lack of a better word, without adequate safeguards. This leads to, surveillance or discrimination against vulnerable population, which we should be at the forefront, ensuring that they are really taken care of and their data is safeguarded. So we have exacerbating inequalities within also communities that are within communities. So these harmful data practices create hierarchies of access for representation. For instance, men might be more likely to participate in surveys due to cultural norms, leaving women and persons with disabilities underrepresented. So this kills the data, resulting in interventions that fail to address the full spectrum of needs. Building equitable humanitarian data practices, if we are to close these gaps, we must reimagine our approach to humanitarian data and also ensure that collection and use of this data is participatory. Sorry. So we need to commit to several things. And number one, we need to commit to be inclusive. We need to commit to be inclusive. In our design, we must also involve marginalized groups in designing data collection tools. So this participatory approach ensures that these tools are inclusive and culturally sensitive. For example, working with women with disabilities can identify hidden barriers that are unmet, and the needs that are also unmet. We also need to disaggregate data. We also analyze intersectional vulnerabilities, disaggregation by gender, age, disability, and other factors as non-negotiable. it should be non-negotiable, because if we are deliberate in ensuring that these people are not left behind, we should ensure that all these factors are put into consideration. So thank you very much, and I really appreciate to be in this panel.
Thank you, Angeline, and we appreciate to have you here. You've covered a lot of ground there, but I'm really excited you brought up the centrality of trust, this data collection, which we have often as humanitarians signed up to. I'm sure you would struggle to find a humanitarian agency that doesn't have a policy that says it commits to collecting intersectional data, disaggregating it and providing all of that. But we sometimes fail to even meet those very standards that we aspire to, and it's so important to keep coming back to that. Monica, you have a tremendous amount of experience of applied humanitarian technologies in crisis settings. And I wonder if you could reflect on some of that trust building and what goes wrong when it gets to that field level. What's stopping us from implementing what we already know are very good approaches to participation and accountability that involve communities meaningfully?
Yes, and I'm going to pick it up from something that Nyalleng talked quite a lot about, which is the concept of ground truthing data. And from years of being at the forefront of deploying technology, ensuring that technology is adopted by different communities, I think one of the key missing pieces, or where there is kind of a broken line, has to do with ground truthing. And this is because at that level, what communities or what the end user is looking at is involvement in a process. It's being at the forefront of validating kind of what data is being collected, being able to actually relate to it in their day-to-day kind of activities. And a lot of times we have to agree that there isn't time for that. There isn't time, there isn't resources for us to actually go and say, candidly, we have been collecting this kind of data. We started from January. This is where we are, and this is how we expect you to either contribute to it or how we expect you to use it for your day-to-day kind of activities. So I think there is a bit of a gap when it comes to the concept of participation, but also very specifically that there isn't much of, kind of space to actually allow for practical participation or ground truthing or validation of some of the tools or some of the data that we're actually putting out there, or that we're actually asking people to contribute and improve on during kind of field work.
Great, we'll come back to that, and also how many CDAC members are in the audience who have very good tools and techniques that can also do some of that ground truthing for us now. I'd like to turn to you, Patrick, to talk about the stories that we tell about these crisis situations, because data is one thing, but narrative is also very important in how communities affected by crisis are perceived. I wonder if you might tell us what the role of media is in narrating crisis settings.
Well, I think a lot of how we understand many of these communities, if we don't live in them, is through what the media tells us about. And unfortunately, in many ways, media tends to misrepresent communities. They are normally presented as almost flat. Everybody lives in a tent. Everybody is displaced. Everybody is a victim of this, the other. But these communities are very diverse, even within themselves. And even in how they understand themselves, and even how they see what their needs are. They are very much as human as the rest of you are. And I think that in many cases, there's a tendency to try and put them in a mob. It's just in this sort of undifferentiated mess. And this is then how we respond to them. And I think in that sense, it's really not, it becomes quite unhelpful. The second thing is there's a way in which, or how media talks about this undifferentiated mess, is that, again, the solutions become similarly just do this thing. Lots of times it will be donate a few dollars and problem will be solved. Think about how the Ethiopia crisis, for example, was presented. in 1984, for those of you who are as old as I am. And a lot of times this misrepresents what the crisis is. So we see the outcome of it, but not really what has led to it. And the discussions then become less about solving the problem, which is many times a political problem, to sort of dealing with the superficial ways that it has manifested. It's really dealing with the manifestations of it. And then what happens is we end up, I remember there was a case in Somalia where people responded to a call for, to these reports of hunger, not by looking at the problem that was there, which a lot of it was not that there wasn't food, but it couldn't get where it was supposed to, but by sending in food. People are hungry, let's feed them. And then what happens is the farmers who are actually growing finally suddenly find we can't sell the food that we are growing. And so they stop growing, So then next year there's a problem. So when we think we are helping, many times, we are getting into this problem, we are creating this, we are perpetuating rather these cycles of need rather than fixing it. And if we don't actually sit down and think about what are the core root problems, many times I think the responses tend not to be necessarily helpful.
And perhaps there's a word of caution for all of us in there. We have told some quite deliberate, well-trodden stories about crisis communities over several decades. We are 40 years on from the Band-Aid moment, and I think we've evolved as a humanitarian sector, and we're thinking about things like the market economy that would be going on around a famine and the political economy that would be going on around a famine. But somehow we haven't quite cracked it in thinking about the political economy around data and power and who's invisible and which incentives are driving that invisibility. And so to bring it back to something that you mentioned, Nyalleng, in your talk, you were calling for a sort of reimagining as we think through how you build and who gets to develop and who gets to decide what's important. I wonder if you could maybe just explain some of those power dynamics that are happening within tech at the moment that are very far from the field and from humanitarian crisis, but as we see more and more take-up of technologies within humanitarian agencies, within those settings, we do need to be aware of those incentives that are happening upstream.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question because, this is we are miles away from the AI we used to build where we were like making little robots that run around in a lab, or like you had your little 100 rows of data and you were making nice little plots and dots. Right now, these big companies are very big and they're very powerful. Tech companies are incredibly powerful. They have all the money and they are also being given a lot of power. They are probably being given a lot of power because also they lobby very hard. There was a report that just came out recently, I think it was Reuters, that showed about like the lobbying power of tech companies in the United States. They are also lobbying in the EU. They are lobbying everywhere. And what that means, it means that they get to define what tech is. They get to define what AI is. They get to define what are important problems. And what are the important things we should be doing and what things we should be putting our money to. They're literally saying that it's sure, we're going to dry up towns. Sure, we're going to, burn up. The climate can get a little bit warmer because we're going to solve, we're going to create an omnipotent AI that's going to solve everybody's problems. But that's because they have the power. And like in the humanitarian space, the UN, I think they had that special envoy, right? And the special, the vice president of that is the vice president of Google, right? You pick whatever. Now, what that happens is, so last week there was a meeting between the OECD and the AU, and they're drafting the continental strategy. Well, they've drafted it, but now they're drafting the implementation of the AI continental strategy. So we're in this meeting, is in Cairo. We're in this meeting, and one of the people who goes up and, is an expert, and he is cautioning Africans, obviously it's the AU, right, about the harms that are going to befall us because of AI. And one of the things is going to be job losses. And it's going to be, we're going to have job losses because a lot of Africans have low-skilled labor, and so that low-skilled labor is going to be automated. This is the rationale. Now, the problem, of course, is evidence has shown that, for example, tech companies have been cutting so much, right? Because they are automating the writing of software. So the very skilled people, right? The whole thing, like they've been cutting down like financial planners, all of the things that can be automatically calculated, that's the jobs that have actually been gone. Now you see somebody who is influencing policy, because really the people in the audience were just like losing their mind because they get so scared. He is influencing policy, but he's not very aware about what's on the ground, because I wonder, there is so much of the African economy that is based on the lady that's selling onions and tomatoes out on the street, where many of us, this is where we shop. Now, how do you replace that person? How do you AI out that economy? And it's a big economy. So this is the thing. But because this person sits in this office with these titles that he has, he's going to influence policy. And so instead of our governments policing, like actually implementing policy and supporting AI that actually works for us, instead, we're going to be spending all of our budgets chasing on how to build AI safety institution in every country, even the ones with like 24% internet penetration. We're going to be doing that. We're going to be regulating over systems that we have no jurisdiction over. So this is the thing about power that actually gets to me for me. It's like, and it's, I think in terms, the thing that's made me look inwards, you know, like there's so much noise. What can we do?
Fascinating. So perhaps in addition to how do we build differently, how do we regulate differently from this region up and out?
And
how does that resilience in the economy look like differently? And what does that mean when you take it into the aid sector, which doesn't look that different from crisis to crisis? Which is adopting at pace some of these technologies. And let's be honest, there's some really good work happening here. And Monica, I'm going to put you on the spot and say, what are we getting right? Because we've collected a lot of data, at least for the last decade, as we digitalized humanitarian action, and that led to great efficiencies and larger reach. What's the sort of latest things that you're excited about in terms of AI use cases in humanitarian action?
That's a good question. I think one of the things I'm becoming excited about, and it's not an end, it's not a tangible thing, is I'm seeing more and more of us are coming to an acceptance that AI, like most technology, is a means to an end. And what I mean by that is, I think there was a point where a year or 2 years ago, it's whenever you walked into any room, AI was positioned as the kind of the beginning and the end. It's almost, if you're not using it, if it's not part of your co-programming, if it's not influencing how you're making decisions, then you're getting it wrong. So I do feel there is a bit of that recognition of AI and technologies themselves are a means to an end. And so we start to ask ourselves the hard questions of what is the end that we are trying to get to? If the end is trying to get more money in people's hands, is trying to make a decision in terms of where people live, then we start to peel back the detail of it. What does this practically mean in terms of what have we built? What technologies is being used? Who is actually being affected by it? So we start to peel back on that. So I think for me, I know we have a bit of a journey to go, but I'm also very excited when I'm in spaces where we are being very honest and actually admitting that there is a human element that's missing in these conversations. There is a power, there's a political conversation that needs to happen, and we are still not getting down to the kind of the root of the problem, because so we need to kind of shift away from AI and technologies being the beginning and the end of it all in the humanitarian space.
Fantastic, thanks. So there's hope in there in the evolution of the conversation. Like there's lots of these discussions about how can we use AI well, should we, with what use cases? And people have said very promising things about back end where you improve the efficiency of supply chains and various things, or we use it to gather insights for better, faster anticipatory action and potentially with life-saving consequences. So we want to make sure that we can really maximize those opportunities and that we're also collectively able to identify when something is snake oil, to bring it back to Nyalleng's slide. And we haven't quite got to the level of sophistication and maturity within the sector yet. I certainly, hands up, not always confident in being able to identify one from the other. But you're right, we're on a journey, and there's a sort of literacy journey that we're all on. One thing that we do talk a lot about in the humanitarian sector is our intent to localize or to be more locally driven. And it strikes me that we're sitting here in Nairobi, where you have incredible tech entrepreneurialism. We're in the iHub. There's so many cool people sat next door doing cool things with startups. And yet we are trapped, it seems, in our procurement options as humanitarians, or at least we tend towards larger technology opportunities. I wonder if perhaps Patrick or Monica might be able to come into what might we be able to do differently to promote local tech opportunities in this space? Is that even on the cards? Are we close to being able to procure this sort of technology locally in Nairobi or on the continent?
I mean, I don't work at a humanitarian agency, so I don't know what your procurement is. But I would say that, yes, I mean, there are, of course, capacities that exist in these spaces, and not just in tech, I mean, all across the world, as in local people know how to do stuff. And a lot of times there's this idea, I think, that's kind of embedded in this thought of that we're going to help them, that these people are, in essence, helpless, you know, which is not true. And it's a lot of it is in simply how the portrayals are, you know, and things. So yes, there are, and they do exist, these capacities. My bigger question and problem is we are trying to get better at doing what? What are we trying to localize? You know, and a lot of times, in fact, the discussions I've had about localization, unfortunately, become very much about taking bad practices that are being done in Geneva, London, etc., and bringing them to Nairobi. It's kind of what Kenya has done with what we call devolution. We've taken really bad, corrupt practices that are done in Nairobi and taken them to Machakos, and we've said we are localized, we are helping the locals be better. But actually, it's not. We're just exporting bad habits. You know, and I wonder to what extent localization is actually a rethinking of power, is a rethinking of the politics of humanitarianism and who makes decisions for whom, you know, who benefits for this. So if we're becoming more efficient at being humanitarian, when really we should be more efficient at putting ourselves out of a job, you know, in the end, if we're actually doing well, then we shouldn't have crises happening all the time, you know. But if we're there and we're getting better at responding to crises and not solving them, are we actually doing well? Is that something that we want to be proud of doing? You know, those are the sorts of questions I'd want us, or I'd hope humanitarians are engaging. You know, they're engaging with the politics of things. You know, so are we getting better at feeding people in Gaza as they are being born? Is a question I would find very perverse, you know, because it should be, are we getting better at stopping them being born? You know, and that for me is kind of in a nutshell brings it back to when we say we want to utilize local capacities, what do we think the locals would want to use those capacities for? And a lot of times they may not be for the ends and goals that, you know, we think would be appropriate. Sorry.
That's great. How we decide where we're going to put the force of effort to solving what kind of crisis is it fundamentally political and ethical question? And we often hear people claiming that technology is neutral, not political. And I think what we could maybe have a conversation about is do we agree with that statement? Do we think that tech in these sorts of crisis settings is actually a apolitical choice? When we put it into the perspective of this, where is that tech originating from and who benefits from its use? Monica, is tech neutral?
I I really agree with Patrick, because I feel at the point where we are deploying technology and asking ourselves if it is neutral, maybe we're asking that question a little bit too late, in the sense that what actually creates kind of a neutral environment. We're trying again to create a situation where we are saying everything is equal. We are trying to kind of put a Kenyan market, a US market. We're trying to really compress them and also put them at the same level. And I think the challenge with that is we then miss out on why we all know that it's not a neutral environment, or why we all know that there is kind of unfair competition. So we try to kind of cover up the realities of, by the time we're getting to a place where we're actually asking ourselves those questions, it means we know there is either a process that isn't right, or it means that we are actually recognizing the unfairness of kind of that environment or that situation that we're in. And I think there is also another something that I often really kind of struggle with, or that I'm hoping to see more, let me use the word advocacy towards. It's the idea that when technology is deployed in this community, it's something that's happening to us. And those of us who are in this area, we've actually are not in a place to engage, or are not in a place to question. And there's so much nuance around it. But I think there's also a responsibility slightly to, especially to communities, to end users, to actually be bold and question and critique some of these tools, and be part of the conversation in a more practical way, because then I've seen in some of the instances, for example, we'll try and deploy a new tech tool, but we all know, for example, the AI conversation. I know people who have been building and working behind the scenes in big tech and building tools around AI for close to 25 years. They're actually hanging their boots and saying, I'm moving on to do something else. Is generative AI new? Maybe it's recent, but is the whole AI conversation kind of just now coming into the space? And I think there's a lot of other things that come into place. There might be, NDAs, and these things might not be just up in our, in our day-to-day environment. But I think there's also a question of, are we building now when it's a little bit too late? And then what exactly are we building? Are we replicating? Are we keen on addressing an actual problem? Or are we, kind of being just part of the statistics?
It strikes me when you were speaking that there's maybe also a opportunity for the continent here, in that the large language models that have been built elsewhere, you're in a position to now maybe negotiate differently about what models are built on what data sets here. And that's something that potentially collectively can be negotiated by communities if they're aware of what's at stake, and if we're all on that journey together. But one of the challenges that we found is it's difficult enough within the humanitarian sector to educate ourselves on the basics, to understand these things. Many people don't have access to people that have been working on this for 25 years. They're often grappling around trying to get emergency training to understand what's going on. But perhaps even more importantly, there is very limited educational opportunities going on amongst the very communities that we're trying to help directly, let alone conversations with them about their perceptions that are meaningful and that are informing some of these regulatory decisions or commercial decisions. One of the things that the CDAC network is trying to do is to work with our members about how we can get more people having these kind of conversations with crisis-affected communities themselves. And as Angeline shows, there is the ability to work towards becoming a data values advocate, and that opportunity can also be extended to crisis-affected communities directly. We will be working more on that in the coming days for those who are members. Patrick, come on in.
Yeah. Sometimes I find the discussion that people can't participate because they're not educated enough a bit problematic. People know what they want. They may not be able to utilize certain language or certain terms. But in general, if you're actually trying to provide a service that they would recognize as a service, giving them, they know what they want. And a lot of times it's not them lacking education. It's really us, sort of speaking in a different tongue to them, not going and understanding what they want, what they're saying. And a lot of times, and I've seen this in Kenya a lot of times with people sort of, with especially governments, unfortunately, trying to pretend that, because people don't have degrees, we can't talk to them. Because people can't speak English, we can't engage with them. They've got to go through, they have to be able to do mathematics to understand the budget, Not really, These people know how to plan. They know the essence of, and they can express themselves. They can tell you what they want. They know when they're getting played, and things. But we are not willing to listen at the level at which they are speaking, because we have kind of devalued that. So it's just something that kind of always sticks out to me whenever people say, we need to educate them so that they can participate. No, actually, it's
a very good word. It's a very good word of caution. And you're preaching the CDAC language here now, Patrick. One of the challenges we're constantly asking about is why are we not listening more well to the communities that we're working with? And we do have to be a bit frank. Monica and I are catching eyes and rolling our eyes at one another, because the humanitarian system and the aid system writ large, for all its promises, has made great strides in trying to listen well to communities affected by crisis. But we still have a long way to go before we're truly accountable and demand-driven, and in a sort of situation of co-creation where we're really listening to that local knowledge. So, of course, the arrival of all of these opportunities and new technologies comes into that already quite challenged humanitarian sector that is trying to do better, but itself could go a little bit further. Monica, what do you think?
Yes, I see Nyalleng has her microphone up, but I'll go first. And I think I call it introducing barriers to participation. So we're trying to get more participation, but whether it's unknowingly or intentionally, we're actually introducing barriers that actually kill participation. And whether that means what time you're having, your public baraza or your data collection activity. So it's those small things that boil down to, kind of the human elements, time, who, where, language is a big one. And the reason why I say it's introducing barriers to participation is because we historically know that, and we've seen it a lot, even though English might not be kind of a shared language amongst us, there's other things we can use, whether that's images, videos, or sign language. There's so many other ways to kind of break such barriers. But if we make it about, say, language, it has to be in this language, then we're intentionally sort of introducing a barrier to how we carry out some of this work.
Key points.
I actually just had a question, which is like, as the waves of technology are coming, do people usually know what they want to do with the technology? Because I kind of feel like it's always this rush. There's a rush. It's like a rush to where, right? Like, what do you want to do with AI? Like, what? So yeah, so this is the thing, like even like to the people that are in the room that are in the humanitarian space, right? What do you want AI to do for you? Like, what is the optimization that you seek?
Perhaps we'll get some feedback from the floor in a second. We're almost at our end, but Angeline has kindly promised to end this session with a positive and hopeful note. So Angeline, if I may turn to you and ask us what solutions and advice you'd like to leave us with before we open for questions.
Thank you very much. Once again, I'm so glad to listen to great people in this panel. And I know that the first step for sure of getting it right is by designing systems that reflect the diversity of the communities who are in crisis. I come from a community who are pastoralists, and often we get these times when people have this cattle rustling and there's war between different communities. And I keep wondering how these people are accounted for in terms of data, and how their needs are brought to the fore that could also influence policies that are tailored to supporting these same people. And I'm glad that we have spoken about accessibility in terms of language as a barrier and how we can make the community be co-creators and not people who can give information, but people who can participate meaningfully in ensuring that their issues are at the fore. Because there's no one who can give real information rather than the person within the same community. So I also feel that we have organizations of persons with disabilities, we have humanitarian organizations, we have people, women-led organizations. So the question is, how can we bring them to be collaborators in terms of how they issue data, and how we can also bring in policy makers so that they are able to come up with policies that are influenced, or rather the policies are influenced by the data that is collected. Because if policies do not, is not tailored from the data we collect, then the policies the implementation of the policies might be problematic. And so we don't need the policies to be problematic. We need policies that are more inclusive and that does not leave anyone behind. And I would not want to forget to talk about the data values advocates. I would urge all of us to support this initiative so that we can also bring on board people, communities in crisis to be data values advocates, because they are the ones who are going to come in handy in ensuring that they are brought to the table, they're part of the table, or they are brought to the table and they're not just the recipients, but they contribute meaningfully in ensuring that their space is there and their issues are heard and their voice listened to, and the issues that they bring on board is clearly taken care of. So I would like to say that partners and all people in data must ensure that all these people with all these intersectionalities are brought on board. They are brought to the table and they are co-creators and partners to inclusive data. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Angeline, and thank you, panelists, for provocative contributions. We went through trust, we went through data, we went through blind spots and assumptions and biases within humanitarians. We talked about tech and power and politics. And I am happy to open it up for questions from the floor, or indeed reflections. If anyone is sitting here thinking, wow, this is a lot, please feel free to come in and direct our attention or the panelists' attention to any area that you would like.
Thank you. Hi, my name's Irene. I have a question for Nyalleng. You said that it's really important for organizations to think about, what is the problem they're trying to solve with AI before they jump into the crazy world of AI. I'm wondering what guidance you could give to organizations that might not be AI experts and are really trying to weigh up the risks and benefits of whether AI really is the solution they're looking for, or whether there might be a different approach. How do you go about that decision-making process?
Okay, so the question is, how do you decide if this is a suitable space for AI? First thing, this is computational, right? So the problem there has to be a sensible way that you can translate the problem into a mathematical format. Okay, so this is why, for example, AI will struggle with things like emotions, right? But you can capture speech, for example, because there's a pattern in speech, right? So you can estimate that. So that's the first thing. You have to think about, what am I capturing here, right? Is it something that can be codified? If it can be codified, sure. You have to have enough data. The more complex the problem, the more data you're going to need. But the beautiful thing is, if you have context, even if a problem is complex, then you actually, I would say, go with the human instead of the machine. If you have context and you have deep knowledge, this is because the deeper you need to go, the more finer your data has to be and the larger the scope you have to be. Then, of course, there's the thing of, can you even see whether you have the right answer or not? Can you evaluate the goodness of this solution? This is the part where you have to have subject experts or practitioners. Do you have practitioners who can actually tell you that, yes, this is the solution, right? And practitioners are not people with degrees, right? Practitioners exactly could be, these are the people who you are building for. These are the practitioners. These are the people who understand the problem and can recognize the solution. So if you've got these kinds of things, if you've got the machinery and you've decided that the problem is the one that, you need to automate it because also the scale. If the problem is small, you can just look at it, right? Do a bar plot. You don't need that. So it's some of these things. And if you don't have the compute, can you get the compute? Like all of these sorts of things. I actually think if you want to build something impactful, take quite a bit of time to just sit with the problem and consulting with subject experts without building anything. And you don't have to build something that solves the entire problem. You can have human, machine, and it's a pipeline.
Thank you, Nyalleng. And useful for us to take a pause and take our time. Thank you, Irene. There was a question that came in on the online chat about, are there any red lines on humanitarian AI use cases? Should we be thinking about them now? And that's for any of the panelists.
Audience.
Pardon?
That also sounds like a question for the audience. It sounds
It's
like
a question for the audience.
people
What
in
are
the
the red lines? What are
sector.
the red lines? There are some good practices that humanitarians have worked on for a long time, based around our humanitarian principles, our standards, sphere standards, collective accountability standards, and we pay particular attention to particularly marginalized or vulnerable groups within the communities that we work with, or at least we commit to. So as I'll take the privilege of having the microphone, I'll suggest that we have to revisit some of those values and prioritize how we approach this with caution. But we don't actually have any agreed red lines yet. Arnie, do I see you wanting to come in? Could someone... There's a couple of questions in the audience. Is there a microphone?
Yes, I had a question.
Okay, great.
It may divert from this conversation a bit.
So please, we'll take your question, and then if we could pass it down to Arnie at the
Sure.
front, that would be great. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Nassim. My question is a follow-up to the previous question, but also talking about AI experimentation. I think there has been always this many resources going into AI research for years, right? And we know the application across many sectors, but I think it's not as much of a focal point or a focus for humanitarians and the humanitarian sector. So when we say that we don't know the use cases for AI in the humanitarian sector, is it partially because we haven't done our research and our experimentation, and how much capacity do we have for that experimentation in this sector? Because I think sometimes we can look at it as we need to use AI to know what it can do for us in order to understand its value in the context, instead of just waiting to understand our needs, or as an alternative way and method to understand the applications of AI in the sector. So thanks.
Good point. What are we learning from elsewhere that we can apply before we make the mistakes in the humanitarian sector? And there's certainly plenty of social justice and rights-based discussions going on elsewhere that have been looking at this particular, and in particular, humanitarians would do well to link up with some of those conversations, I think. Arnie, should we take a comment from you, and then we'll come back to the panel?
Yeah, my name is Arend Kopermäki. I'm from Deutsche Welle, DW Academy. And thinking about the red lines, I think the obvious one is, how can we make sure that technology doesn't make things worse? Especially looking, well, what was spoken about already, looking at language, looking at existing inequalities that are maybe exacerbated through the way we use technology already now, the kind of advantage native English speakers have, or people who speak English well, moving in the digital space. Lots of people are excluded already. And now we're introducing yet another technology, yet more tools that so far rely a lot on specific languages. And I think I heard in the CDAC meeting that even Kiswahili has about as many Wikipedia articles as Breton, which is spoken like in the Bretagne part of France. And you know, Kiswahili being one of the big languages in Africa. So I do see red lines in that you know, technology might make things worse if we're not careful, and thinking about the fact that, yeah, technology can deal with mathematics well, it cannot deal well with emotions. Well, we still used it on emotions and made it kind of one of the main mechanism of how our communication works in social media. It started as a like and ended up in kind of a mechanism that promotes hate quite a bit. And now we're introducing even more technology to even more sensitive fields. So what can we do to safeguard against the risks of kind of technology getting out of hand?
So there's definitely something in there about how are we all acknowledging that we're working in a very heightened vulnerability setting? And if so, what are we doing differently there than we might in some other setting? And what can we learn from these other settings to avoid doing that harm in humanitarian settings? Who would like to have a pop at this?
Well, I think one of the things that I would I don't know how to phrase it. It's kind of, do you see AI or one of my red lines would be, do you see AI as a replacement for the human? You know, in the sense that, is it coming in there and then removing the complexity of human interaction and reducing it to simply a few, as she says, patterns, a few things that we can, you know, put into an algorithm or, you know, whatever device or formulas that we have, you know. These are not spaces, and especially I would imagine humanitarian spaces of humanitarian crisis, that you can easily, you know, differentiate. This is only for ABCD, and we can remove emotion from here. The same way you cannot remove the politics from things, as much as humanitarians have tried. You cannot. You know, this, you have to deal with people in their complexity, in their totality, you know. And I wonder to what extent people start thinking of AI as a replacement for that complexity, or as a way of managing, quote unquote, complexity rather than dealing with, rather than actually confronting, you know. And for me, that would probably be where I would start drawing lines and saying that it is not suited, you know, within particular certain interactions, you know, especially when you're going outside, how organizations go into, you know, how they deal or interact with communities there. I think many problems about interacting,
So the more we automate, maybe the less we lose the humanity. And humanity is the first principle in humanitarian action, and we may be very well automating ourselves away from it at speed. I don't know about you or others in the audience, but I particularly love when my bank tells me to interact with a chatbot whenever I have a problem, and I spend a lot of time when it feels very important to me and my life isn't on the line and my livelihood isn't on the line, and it's incredibly frustrating and disempowering. And I often think, how would this feel if I were being asked to do it in French, which I hated at school and it's the closest I've come to in a second language. So I feel just maintaining that humanity in this conversation and thinking, what would this look like for Fatima in South Central Somalia, etc., would be a good guiding principle as we approach these problems.
That comes to mind as you're having this conversation, there's often a path that we see. So you're moving from data all through to what we call decision making. There's often a path that we see. We are moving from data all the way to solving a problem or to the nitty-gritties of a decision that we need to make. And practically, I have seen instances where AI can actually fast track some processes or some stages when you're dealing with really high volumes of data that are really well structured. So we're starting to look at which buildings got damaged following a flood. The first step of that is really how many buildings did we even have? Did we have a road? So we have a first layer of huge volumes of data, very simple, let me say, variables or attributes that we're looking at. We just want to know roads, kilometers of roads. We want to know number of buildings. But as you move further and you start to interrogate, did the roofing system contribute to why this house was damaged? Were people who are on the top floor or the bottom floor hit more by this particular instance? Then at that point, you will need more advanced, let me say, models, and often they don't exist. It's something that somebody needs to sit down and feed into a system and then start from scratch. But again, that's a crisis situation where we really don't have time to quickly convene people and start to build that. And that's where the human element comes in. And it all boils down back to how complicated is this, the kind of the end goal, or how detailed do we want to get when it comes to the data that we have, and we've gotten past the very high level data set that we just needed analyzed, give us a direction, and then we start to get into the detail of taking up a decision. So I do think there's almost a direction in terms of where is AI applied and where it will be complicated to have a direct application. But then there are still some nuances that mean we have to evaluate each situation as we move along.
It's a work in progress. There's been furious agreement with something that you said, Patrick, around the blind spots that we have in our language. And I may have been guilty here. Someone was pointing out in saying simply the community. It's become a catch-all phrase that often ends up meaning people with more power who are easiest for NGOs and UN agencies to engage. We need to make special efforts, as Angeline has been mentioning, whether in technology or other tools, to truly involve people who are in marginalized populations. And that was very much agreed by people online. And thank you to those who have been interacting there. I am very conscious that there has been some people creeping in the background to deliver some nice drinks for us on the roof terrace as we've been talking. And so I want to make sure that we have plenty of time to continue this conversation outside. But my big takeaway from some of these challenges is that really to ensure that these technologies live up to their potential, whatever that potential might be, but particularly in humanitarian settings, it's really about how we use the tech. And that's really about us. That's about what we as individuals are going to do differently in how we approach these conversations, who we are thinking about, and how we want to guide them in terms of the value sets that they will have to ascribe by. So I'm going to leave it all with you. What are you going to do to ensure that we share power in the design and governance of technologies? And with that, I'd like to invite everybody to give a warm round of applause to our panelists who've been so kind. We'll see you outside. Thank you.
Recording stopped.